Yeah, no, so I mean, it's wonderful to be here in the Archizoom space. Thank you for hosting us. And, you know, we're delighted to have these fantastic blankets and all the kind of setup where everyone is comfortable to attend this talk. So you mentioned the series is called Mercury Rising, Architecture Beyond Greenwashing. I think there is also this possibility of thinking about greenwashing as something extending not only to the way that architecture is responding to, let's say, climate emergency, but more in general about the tendency of the industry to enter into this kind of generally washing kind of entities. So I would just briefly introduce Jennifer and Tom. So Jennifer Newsom and Tom Carruthers are architects, artists, and co-founders of the architect practice Dream the Combine based in Ithaca and Minneapolis. Together, they have produced numerous site-specific installations, which I'm sure they will talk about, that explore metaphor, perceptual uncertainties, and the boundary between real and illusory space. Dream the Combine are winners of the 2022-2023 Rome Prize in Architecture, where they actually based, and they thank you for traveling from Rome today. To us, we're really delighted to have you. There is a kind of impressive list of awards and prizes that I will not go into, but it's really wonderful to have you here. You know, your work has been exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art and MoMA in New York, but also in numerous other places, which you will probably show us, I hope, some of the works. And of course, some of you had the chance to read some of the texts that also tackle the work, and then also the interviews, and we will be very interested in discussing some of the topics that are brought in there. So with no further delay, I will leave you the floor. I will ask you to welcome warmly Jennifer and Tom.
Okay. Maybe I can switch off the lights so we see your slides better.
That sounds great. Ooh. That sounds very, maybe you can
Sorry.
turn it down a little bit.
Yeah.
I also have a very loud voice, so I understand this is needed for Zoom, perhaps, but I can project.
Where's the Zoom camera? Hello, Zoom.
Yeah, there. Okay. Well, thank you so much for having us. Both to Charlotte and to Kathy for inviting us here. It was a nice train ride up through the mountains. So
Thank you, Cyril, for the introduction. In 2017 or so, we started asking ourselves, if architecture is a service profession, what are we working in service of? The abstract for this lecture series asks how design practice pivots in the face of change. And after reading a couple of articles that we shared with Kathy, you might be thinking that Dream the Combine is just constantly pivoting, like a sort of whirling dervish. Nonetheless, the brief asks, is real sustainability in architecture planning possible? So I feel that we're forced into a conflict here. As designers, for us to make anything at all relies upon the mobilization of incredible forces, be they of energy, capital, of labor, and commitment. There is movement of material from here to there, and something hopefully is transformed in a positive way. Nonetheless, it's inherently extractive. And yet for the survival of us as a species, it seems that we're to be ever more novel in addressing inequalities in our environment. How might everyone, we can ask, have access to clean air, water, shelter, perhaps even healthcare and education? To provide these means, we must build something. We cannot be disillusioned with the futility of creation, however, nor can we afford as architects to be cynical and offer the image without the substance or its subtext. There are forms of accountability, after all. This lecture series abstract hints at the hypocrisy of building while adhering to the aspirations for equity. The call outlines the paradoxical conditions, or at least that's how they appear to me, for our shared survival. As architects, Jennifer and I are deeply invested in and entangled by the processes by which our built environment reproduces itself. Industrial capitalism has a different agenda than the agenda of the planetary. It creates reciprocal and at times borrowed landscapes, reinscribing center and periphery, where blind spots are purposely created. So sustainability is not a universal notion. In a way, it's a gesture where it's a gesture in one place could mean suffering in another.
Well, thanks. You fixed our citations here. As Edward Glissant never ceased to reiterate, this is a quote from Michel Bende, each of us needs the memory of the other. This is not a matter of charity or of compassion. It is a condition for the survival of our world. If we want to share the world's beauty, he would add, we ought to learn to be united with all of its suffering. We will have to learn to remember together, and this doing, to repair together the world's fabric and its visage. In our work, we think about how we want to be together. We are concerned with social relations, with collective authorship, and multiplicities of view. There is a multivocal chorus that we are interested in. We learn more from the street, perseverance in the face of extreme violence, resistance to regimes of visuality and coercion that are so much a part of daily life, and the ingenuity and change on every corner, and aim to exert some influence within it. We make public installations that are platforms for something to happen. We are concerned with chance encounters and the everydayness of being together. We once discussed with a friend that we use experience as a kind of material. We operate outside of a problem-solution dialectic. Nothing has been solved. This is just continual work, an evolution that does not necessarily include progress. David Scott speaks about the futility and romanticism of mythologizing revolution, that it does not always lead to a liberatory future. There is tension here. There is violence in our work and tenderness too. We make rigid steel appear soft and then we recycle it away, turning it back into a stream of matter that may find another form. The work is massive and ephemeral. Terry Tempest Williams says, quote, a predictable world is another casualty in drought and climate chaos. We are navigating in constant disorientation. We embrace this contrast.
For some years now, we've viewed our practice as a non-objective one. We instead have been concerned with a series of subjects, the relationship between body and space, image and environment. We work out of our own work, and we're concerned with sight, but also sight, and the critique of those and who gets to use those terms. We're concerned increasingly with the procedural memories, not only of ourselves, but of everyone who comes to our installations, and the histories of movement that they bring with them, how regimes of visuality and social codes might precondition a context, and how architectural propositions can be slid into those contexts to change them. So fundamentally, we're concerned primarily with people and not with property. We're concerned with their interrelatedness and their capacity for authorship at whatever scale or register makes sense. Our work is a locus for folks to assert their own agency, a place that is co-authored with everyone who comes to experience it. I think most critically, we're concerned with the imaginative potential of dreaming. The hope there is that it's a way to not only acknowledge and build awareness of our patterns, but perhaps also overwrite them in incisive ways. Something that has been a part of our work here in Rome has been an increased focus on reflection. It's almost as though we've had 10 or 12 years of, well, if you count COVID times, like 25 years of work, field work, if you like. And so this more intense cycle of reflection seems to propose that there are preconditions for love that can be established through architecture.
So when asked, quote from the lecture series abstract, what emancipatory forms of practice allow for accountable and revolutionized construction means, how to face the mistakes of the past and form new values grounded in humility, end quote. We can only respond with the work that we have done and continue to do, highlighting what motivates this effort. And this is an image that we took in Minneapolis. We recommended that students read the first half of The Right to Look. It's a weird article. It's like, it's totally different in the second half, by Nicholas Mirzelef before coming to our talk. And I'll just include a quote here. I want to claim the right to look. It begins at a personal level with a look into someone else's eyes to express friendship, solidarity, of love. That look must be mutual, each inventing the other, or it fails. Now, Bell Hooks describes love as an active practice. When we are loving, we openly and honestly express care, affection, responsibility, respect, commitment, and trust. And how can we extend ourselves lovingly towards one another? And I think it's important, or we think it's important to talk about love in the context of thinking about our planet, about the way in which we are together. Because, I mean, I think we need a kind of change in how we see one another. How can we save the earth? And Western humanism that maybe dominates our modes of interaction first failed to see all of us as human. We still fail to see each other as self. So I think these are kind of dominant modes that we're continually trying to transgress here. Can't give me this.
All right, so the first project is from 2015, and I hope it's not sort of stereotypical of us as architects to want to show like a short selection, like two, maybe three projects here. This first one is an emotional expression and a verbal play on lengthening. And it really came back because of we got to see a concert of Cecile McLaurin-Salvant's recently in Rome. And she has this reflection in a recent interview. People think that I sing love songs, but more and more I'm realizing that I sing about yearning and the imagination that comes from wanting something and not having it. That's really when we're at our most creative. Well, certain things I'm going to say and certain things are going to be left unsaid, and bring it up in the Q&A if you feel like there's just like a disconsonant gulf between those two things. We did this installation in essentially a found object. Minneapolis, like Calgary, has a series of +15s. I don't know if they have those here, but there's an 8-mile network in Minneapolis. If you like, it's a product of a kind of vertically segregated system of pedestrian circulation in Minneapolis. This, to our knowledge, is the only fragment that's been removed from that network. So if you like, it's a link that's been removed from a series of nodes and links. The original location shown here in a kind of red dot shows where it was, only to be removed because of a light rail train that was going to come through, and there was a head clearance. So this is sort of like maybe sort of pedestrian stuff, but you know, it got removed because it was a headbanger. Then a couple of architects buy it for $1 and spend $10,000 to move it.
Not us.
Yeah, not us. Yeah. And it lived here for about 10 years. And so we had a parallel body of work where we would just go here to explore and take pictures to see how this product of a kind of 1970s modernism was becoming a substrate for new life. And through this sort of many-month investigation through sub-zero temperatures, and that includes Fahrenheit as well as Celsius, we became more enamored of its context, which is a kind of original site. It is a public site insofar as it's city-owned land. It's in between a football stadium and these transcontinental railroad tracks. This hulking fragment, this memory, if you like, of another place or system, well, we began to question looking at, come on, brain, it's not going to remember. She's at MIT, she wrote a book on networks, and it'll come back to me when the lecture is over, so we'll do that. Anyway, we looked at this thing becoming a network of its own making. So here's a sort of a drawing with Photoshop of the pre-existing end walls, proposed an idea of what if these things are to become mirrors. And you get this somewhat predictable infinite reflection, a kind of line. So we know what this is. This is sort of known stuff, but nonetheless, here are the implications. You know, our resources that we look at, the precedents, if you like, are diverse. In this case, we're thinking in part about Satiro in Milan by Bramante, which is oriented in such a way such that in order to get southern light to fall upon this particular icon, there's not enough room on this site, so you lose the apse and generates, and that apse is recreated imaginatively through a single point perspective. This perspective is, Jennifer's saying I probably need to go a little quicker here, but there's a lot to talk about here. It's not just a sort of fixed and singular thing. There's actually some movement. As you can see in the plan detail on the top right, there's a kind of parallax that's tied into the perspective. So we were wondering ourselves, what if these static representations can move? So here in our studio, just doing a kind of mock-up to see what might be able to happen if these two mirrors can face each other and they can move like your eye moves left and right, up and down, but it doesn't twist, right? So this wandering vanishing point imaginatively sponsors the creation of new forms, where there's a flexing of infinity that you understand as the image hits your retina. That vision here is both projective and receptive. There's a sort of engagement of seeing something and imagining its product and then sending it back. So this lurching and yearning form, I think, underscores the double entendre of the title. This is shot by Jennifer in a windstorm here in Minneapolis. The project is engaged with doubling, and it was the point in our practice where we began to transition from a concern with ideas of image and space and vision, and even the turning back of vision upon, or visuality back upon itself. And as I just sort of showed through some of the pictures here, we began to provide an, excuse me, I'm not even speaking in complete sentences, provide an inclination of interaction with people. I'm going to show this video.
No, I think what happened was this.
Yes, I do want to talk about it. The slides are supposed to complex of visuality, which I hope we'll come back to in questions, is a complicated one, and one that I think is sort of necessary to understanding the ways that we construct reality. Here, Jennifer has talked about a kind of cynical kind of image making that we're engaged with here, where there's uncertainty about what is before and what is after. In some ways, what came after looks like what should have burned. So this complex of visuality that Nicholas Mirzoev brings up, it's a sort of process, this idea of naming, segregating, and then the aestheticization, which moralizes the whole thing and justifies it as a process, is something that we've been experiencing in our immediate sort of built environment when we were living in Minneapolis, as this was our neighborhood. And this Mirzoev article was really something that was only referred to us within the last 5 or 6 weeks. But it was written about a year before we started working collaboratively together. And so it's been funny to come back to do a series of work over approximately 12 years and have a friend, Justin Thompson with the Recovery Project in Florence, refer something to us that feels like, so seminal from the outset.
I think we had a mismatch in slides, and that whole section is counted here. So I apologize about that. Do you want to just skip to here? No. Okay, that was great.
So for us, the visuality in some ways has been a kind of taking perspective, in this case, a kind of single point perspective, and just beginning to tease it apart in a kind of muscular way to see what else might be possible within the strictures of a means of representing space, and even as Bruno Latour talks about of transporting space from one place to another. But there's, if you like, a kind of direct engagement with a means of representation that is, while deeply problematic, also somehow still generative.
So the Longing Project is kind of like a singular element, this kind of, installation in one fragment that starts to replicate its own network. And then for Hide and Seek, we're looking to take that and move that into a more networked kind of system of multiple elements arrayed in the courtyard at PS1. So I'll just cut off the bottom there, but this is a project that we did in 2018 at MoMA PS1 as part of the Young Architects program. And I think, we talked a bit before about learning from the street. And so you'll see like a kind of mix of presentation slides that we, had to show to like win this competition, but also images of the actual project. And this was a really important precedent for us, which is a performance art piece by Lorraine O'Grady called Art Is. So this is a performance from 1983, where she had 15 dancers who were on this kind of large float going through a parade in Harlem. And these dancers were moving through the crowd with these gilt frames, these gilt boundaries. And people were saying, frame us, we're the art, frame us. And so there's a way in which these kind of framing devices both have a sort of like canonizing gesture of this kind of gilt art historical boundary, but also the people in this photo series exerting their own personal agency of like crossing this border of transgressing this boundary in some way. And so for us, that became a kind of important leitmotif in thinking about our response in this particular site context, which is a courtyard that's bounded by 15-foot high concrete walls. So how do we talk about this as a kind of productive, like social space? The boundary of it is this kind of leftover series of courtyards resulting from a kind of intersecting street patterns. And we wanted to insert something into that context that would actually kind of transgress these edges in some way. So using that kind of strategy from Longing, but now moving it in a kind of series of multiples. So we made these little like urchins to talk about these kind of void spaces piercing through the walls. We work with an engineer and close collaborator, Clayton Binkley. So Clayton and Kristen Strobel, another engineer, then at Arup, we would kind of work on this highly detailed Rhino models to coordinate this process of building this project. And then these are kind of installation shots. And this was happening on like a very fast timeline. So some of these things are hand-drawn, Sunday night, going back and forth. But taking the kind of some of the learnings from Longing, so this kind of single point perspective drawing, this kind of wandering vanishing point, and instead of in the previous example is a tensegrity system that's supporting these kind of mirrored panels. And here it's like a lateral, like brace frame where the crossing of that X is sort of attenuated into these kind of butterflies or pyramids that supports the mirrored panel. And then where these would intersect, where these kind of imagined sort of lines traversing the site would intersect an exterior wall, we would produce these kind of graphite murals on the inside and the outside face. So in each courtyard, there's kind of one idea per space. So this sort of long runway that's denoted with the A, kind of technical booth, and secondary stage is the D. The little baby courtyard has a little bench, and then I showed an image of it earlier. The one marked with B is this kind of large urban scale hammock space. So the kind of program or sort of directive for this competition is to provide seating, shading, and water, which we kind of arrayed sectionally in the space. But we're really interested in this kind of introducing a kind of glitch into this environment to transgress these sort of notions of periphery and border. Thinking about glitches, the kind of impossibility of certain forms, and how that would start to then reorder bodies that were in this space. Or something that is kind of appearing flat, it's actually three-dimensional. Also connecting the inside and the outside of this kind of courtyard space with a large, like these upper trusses were basically like large periscopes. So from one point outside, you could actually look up into these mirrors and down into the courtyard. Then using this kind of mist as almost like an atmospheric static to kind of reset these scenes. So the piece both was for an audience of one, but also really about this kind of multiplying this crowd. Someone who, well, okay, what did you want to say about it? No, go ahead. Yeah, what do you want to say?
I'll do this whole piece again, just for this one image. And if you can see in the mirror, there's a fellow in a blue shirt holding a camera. And this lady at her ease in the middle of the frame and her man are staring him and that camera right in the eye, and they are at their ease. And so as Merzowitz talks about a space of this kind of counter visuality, or as a friend of ours from grad school, Ken Chan, who ran the Asian American Writers Workshop in New York for many years, would call a kind of countercultural space. And here you're beginning to see evidence, a kind of capacity for refusal and maybe another kind of spatial production that was possible.
We also make films, but I think in the interest of time, we're not going to show them. So if people want to go back to that, we can.
We have one more project we'd like to show about in Columbus, Indiana, but really it's more about voices that have perhaps been, not perhaps, have been definitely been suppressed by the presence of this Columbus name. So we could open it up to the floor. Do you want to see a video of that, or do you want to talk about Columbus? No, I'm inclined to show Columbus.
How much time do we have left? Okay.
9 minutes or something.
Yeah. Okay. So, please.
So each one of these projects, we can't claim to have anything solved, right? Like there are certain concerns or problems that come up And to a degree, we get to address them in particular projects or use the project as a vehicle to be able to like tease out certain themes or concerns. We don't really have any with respect to the brief. I just don't want to be clear that I don't know that we have any solutions. You know, we've got some pretty dirty hands. We have some projects that begin with a certain gamble, and they're surprisingly with hide and seek, for example, like that was if you like at the competition basis, we were specifically trying not to create a candy-coated object for the space, that there was a space with a ton of histories, and we began to get a sense at an intuitive level that it was possible to hang a competition entry on an idea of interaction of peoples and the histories that they bring with them. And so that was, if you like, an experimental proposal that actually it was kind of surprising to have the model inside your head and to feel the anxiety, at least for me, when the thing goes live, because it's not done when it's built. And then to see like what happens at different times of day. So here with Columbus, Columbia, Colombo, and Cologne, was another, if you like, a kind of gamble, but one that was based upon we couldn't do a project in this place without addressing the name. So N.K. Jemisin, I don't know if anyone here reads her work. It got me through, not a one, well, it got me through the pandemic. Let me tell you first of a city. It is a city built wrong by your standards. This city sprawls in a way that no modern calm would be permitted to do, since that would require too many miles of walls. And this city's outermost sprawls have branched off along rivers and other lifelines to spawn additional cities, much in the manner of bowl forking and stretching along the rich veins of the growth medium. Too close together, you would think. Too much overlap in territory. They are too connected. Sometimes they have distinct local nicknames, these child cities, especially where they are large or old enough to have spawned child cities of their own. Well, this is superficial. Your perception of their connectedness is correct. They have the same infrastructure, the same culture, the same hungers and fears. Each city is like the other cities. All the cities are effectively one city. This world in this now is the city's name. At the intersection of I-65 and State Road 46 lies a landscape sign maintained by the Public Works Department of the city of Columbus, Indiana, who we also worked with to realize our piece that encourages you to discover Columbus, exclamation point, quote unquote. We encountered this on our first site visit in, was it October of 2020? As winners of the 2021 Irwin and Xenia S Prize, which is a biennial exhibition hosted in the city. This city, not coincidentally, has the second largest number of landmark architectural projects.
I'm going to plug my computer in, sorry.
Go
Go ahead, keep talking.
In the United States, outside of New York City. It's primarily a company town. This is Cummins, right? So this is diesel engines territory. And they're who are funding the award. The science message links Christopher Columbus's efforts, quote unquote, discovering the new world to the world discovering Columbus. This play on words lightly references a very serious set of papal decrees executed from 1452 to 1493 that established the doctrines of discovery, the Dum Diversus, the Romanus Pontifex, and the Inter Caetera. Forgive me if my Latin pronunciation is not up to scratch. These documents enabled the slavery of non-Christians and gave exclusive right to the lands encountered through exploration to the empires who found them, in disregard of the long histories of habitation by indigenous peoples. They opened the door for land theft, resource extraction, slavery, and genocide that are a part of our collective past, at least for those of us who live in America, but you may as well call it your America. Recently, Pope Francis has issued an apology to our First Nations, Inuit and Métis brothers and sisters for the Catholic Church's role in the cultural genocide of residential schools in Canada, where I come from, Vancouver, British Columbia. He said he had, quote, sorrow and shame for the role that a number of Catholics, particularly those with educational responsibilities, have had in all these things that have wounded and abused the First Nations. This is only a first step. So Columbus is not just a berm in Columbus, Indiana. He's a crater on Mars, a movie story. There's a sausage company in there. There's a well-known bike frame company. I mean, it goes on and on and on, especially with a number of locations. To the extent that it makes Columbus as a name almost meaningless. He's everywhere as a system of signification all the time. Columbus is a movie company, school, a movie, a mall, soccer team, a country in South America, a steamy looking novel, a fraternal Catholic order, a district in Panama, a bus. There's actually many of these Columbus companies. It's like a dad joke. A communications company in Barbados, a neighbor to the east of Columbus, Indiana, that they're forever trying to differentiate themselves from. A Nazi era opera. Already brought up the tubing company. An excursion liner, yes, the sausage company, and some pretty great branding. The name Columbus and its conjugates, Columbia in this case, have been proxies for liberty and virtue. Here we see the female personification of the United States, also a euphemism for newness, risk-taking, and curiosity. The juxtaposition of Columbus onto the territory his actions helped expropriate from our first communities is an expression of a series of devastating actions. The genocidal taking and parceling of land into property, that these symbols are being toppled and rethought is a necessary action. The names Columbus, Columbia, Colombo, and Cologne remind us that throughout the phrase, I sometimes just cannot read sentences, but it reminds us of a fraying of our body politic. It brought us into a space of critiquing this idea of nation as it being a singular construction. In the United States, at least politically, there's often a tendency to describe America as a nation. But in fact, it's a kind of metaphorical construct between present and past. It's never so singular as a particular nation. The histories are braided. And these networks of Columbus and his signifiers, they extend globally in every direction. This rhizomatic network is one thing that is connected to all the others.
So we started by kind of mapping the series of points, where we looked at all of these different place names. There are a lot more than just the 58 that we used for the installation, but mapping this Columbus, Columbia, Colombo, and Cologne as this kind of globalized system, traversing the globe. So not only is there Columbus, Indiana as this kind of specific place, this context, and we're making this installation, but really trying to show it as the kind of, sorry, I turned it off. Trying to show it as this much larger, larger grouping. And I'm going to skip forward given this time. So we made this kind of series of props and almost trying to kind of negate the presence of an image in this piece, where the text that's spiraling each one of these columns becomes a kind of counter narrative. So Kathy and a number of other people who worked on this project had the distinct pleasure of like researching all 58 of these places and developing this kind of series of texts that then were placed on each one of these poles. And the text sort of comes in and out of view as you negotiate around this landscape. So it induces a kind of choreography of movement around these poles. So the installation is like, it kind of merges with the existing infrastructure that's there. And it's a series of 58 points that form a kind of map that you can move through. Deep down, deep down. Oh, and each these texts are ones that were on this kind of spiraling text on each of the poles. So it talks about the place, and the year is actually the year that it was named. So obviously people lived in these places for many, many years before they were settled necessarily by Europeans. Deep down, we would like to see our problems resolved by decree from this date onwards, that unresolved grief is considered null and over it perpetual silence. Extinguished by law, all remorse, damn anyone who looks back. Back there is nothing and nothing more. For problems are not resolved, problems have a large family, and on Sundays, everyone goes out for a walk about the problem, your lady and other little problems. So this is very kind of bucolic setting, and trying to have some sort of critique on this very, not particularly self-reflective claim to discover Columbus, just like Columbus discovered America, quote unquote. So we imagine that people would kind of hold on to these poles and navigate around them and spiral around them to read this text. But what was pretty interesting to us is that people would actually read them back and forth to each other. So it kind of moved this text into a different kind of chorus or sounding. And I think maybe we'll end here so we can open up for Q&A. We'll stop here. That's it. Thank you. Thank you much. Basically want to we'll stand. We can first here. We can both first here.
Going to exit.
And thank you for answering the prompt as much as possible, and also I think being very frank with one of the difficulties of this kind of paradox that I'm going to sit here.
Okay.
And
They're multiplying.
I just want to pick up on like two things, and then I will perhaps pass to the response for today, which is Amy Perkins. And thank you for joining us today, which is related to this problem solving, let's say, issue, or I mean, kind of question related to how architecture situates itself as a discipline, and in parallel to what you said about this constant disorientation. So I feel like there is a tension between these two things. I think at times, and we talked about this in the studio as well, how does architecture deal with the fact that it is inherently trying to solve things? And I think we also talked in the studio how we have this tendency to like diagnose things and then fix it by building something.
The answer is always building it. It's an architecture.
Yeah, exactly. I did it by building something, we can fix it. I mean, it's something that you can see prevalently appear across let's say, the political spectrum, where you would solve immigration by building a wall, a kind of lack of visibility by building a new airport, kind of marking your 5-year tenure as a president by making a new museum. I mean, this is something that is kind of also talks of the adjacency between architecture and politics, which we could dwell on. But I'm interested in like thinking outside of this problem solving dialectic, and I guess it's also related to the fact that architecture just has to come to terms with the fact that it has this impossibility of being sustainable. And maybe I would then turn to Amy and ask, in that regard, also in relation to your own practice, and maybe we can then have a little bit of a conversation around that, and then also pass it on to our students who have read the text. But I'll try to pass it to you. Then Jamie, do you want to back to you? Because last time we had this issue with like the responding kind of sideline, and we don't want that to.
Right, so you get that same.
But do you have a microphone? Or I have to back it on?
Yeah.
No, we have.
I mean,
Are these off?
no.
Not you.
Yes.
Right, format's very new to me as well, so I'm going to do my best to
It's invented.
comment and ask questions and start the dialogue. I guess it wasn't at all what I expected your presentation, and it was much more full of beauty and hope. And so I just wanted to comment on that from the beginning, but I guess in relation to what Charlotte was just talking about, currently my main focus has been on teaching for the past 5 years, and I've been teaching in the architecture schools here in Switzerland. And I guess hope has had a big role, so is design and beauty. But I'd say the biggest role has been climate crisis and greenwashing, and what is architects, what is the architect's role starting up in the future with this issue. And the main problem I think I've seen is like a total paralyzing fear of doing anything in even just read an interview, listened to an interview recently with Roger Hallam, who's a climate activist, who was saying it's incredibly depressing, but the carbon is just the middle of it. And focusing on carbon is just like looking at the middle instead of looking at the middle. And it's like a whole new perspective. And I was like, oh my God, it's even more depressing. And how are we as architects able to act in this landscape where it's clearly part of the problem, but also suddenly trying to fix it by looking at something which is just a symptom, even looking at the bigger cause, which is the system, which is broken. And yeah, so it's incredibly depressing, that's what I'm just saying. But what I thought was really beautiful about your project, all the projects you showed, was that actually you actually didn't talk about carbon or climate or really about kind of any of the bigger issues that are clearly underlying them. But somehow your kind of responses were about, we talked about the ephemeral as architecture and experience as material, which I thought was very provocative ways of thinking of the role of the architect, other than just creating style or being a service provider. And I guess I wanted to pass it back to you and ask you about how you deal with this like the problematic, how much you talk about it actually, how much you talk about the kind of politics behind your work, or whether it's just a kind of undercurrent of both acknowledging that it doesn't have to directly influence your decision making. And then the role of cynicism versus hope. The students.
Feel like the depressing context of it. I mean, I think we kind of, yeah, I mean, I think it's very challenging, and we've also sort of sidestepped client-driven process in particular ways because it's, I don't know, maybe very challenging to say the things that we want to say in that way of working. So yeah, I think that I don't know, I don't think we can get paralyzed into just like not doing anything. Like there has to be some sort of way of still navigating, still working through, still, I mean, bringing your creativity to bear on the problem. So yeah, it's interesting because when we were asked to come and speak here, I thought, well, you know, what is my take on like the topic of greenwashing? It's not necessarily like a term that we like use between the two of us in our practice. But I do think that fundamentally for me, it's like addressing this sort of ecological crisis in any sort of way requires a profound amount of imagination. You have to have some capacity to dream, to imagine the world differently than it is, that we're on this kind of like collision course, and to get out of that loop, to get out of this kind of recursive pattern that we have set up. You have to be willing to go on the oblique to find some other kind of way. So, you know, maybe it's we're addressing it more in a kind of sort of hybridized art architecture context, but certainly thinking about, you know, this is not like the only reality that we like can create. You know, we don't have to keep like reproducing the same images, reproducing the same forms. The photo series that we did of Minneapolis, whereas there's a series of kind of diptychs where there's this confusion of like what is before and after. It's like, okay, the response when the entire city is like burning is to just make the same thing again. So, you know, that's by design. Like to imagine something out of that, then we have to mobilize our imagination in a different kind of way. So, you know, I think for me, the policy, the technical prowess, the invention, you know, thinking about material in very specific ways, like there's a kind of umbrella over that is about rethinking how we want to relate to one another. So.
I mean, I hear you about the depression. I mean, there's like the aspect of this that are just dismaying, right? And honestly, like traumatic. Like we have two youngish kids. And so it would be, I think, disingenuous to be so cynical as to say that things are doomed, right? Because then I've done like a real disservice to two human beings. I've sort of brought them into a lie. So there's got to be room. And I think that's why the focus on the imaginative capacity and why I think architecture has a kind of like generative potential that I kind of disagree with the idea that sustainability is impossible. Although it can feel that way, right? When you get exhausted and when you go through the amount of time and effort that it takes to realize any work of architecture, the level of commitment and, dare I say it, sacrifice, right? There's a lot that just gets necessarily moved outside. You know, we may not foreground explicit conversations about carbon content in the work. There are, although I want to say, like, part of the excitement for me about being invited to be here was to, and after seeing what the brief is to be open to positive critique, because it's a gift. And we've tried working almost exclusively with materials that are entirely recyclable, if not like highly recyclable. like 95, 97% or something for steel. And there is something sort of interesting about pulling material out of a particular, like Bill McDonough calls it, these industrial nutrients, like pulling them out of one sort of supply chain moment into a particular place that for a particular time, inviting others in for authorship in that time, and then saying thank you and letting it go. I've struggled with that because at times it can feel like Goya's painting of Saturn eating his children when we recycle these things. There's this, Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, she speaks so eloquently about, I don't think we had this in the deck, but it was, the bones of love are everywhere, but I won't, what's the last word?
There'll be no dying.
There'll be no dying here with me. And so there's a way that architecture doesn't diminish and go away with the physical presence leaving. Like there's a way that these projects, hopefully in some way, imaginatively perhaps, are still active today in the room, even though we're showing images and sharing words. So there's sometimes pressures for these arbitrary closures, sort of forcing therefore certain emotions upon us, grief or depression, whatever it is, but actually like certain things are still active and are still living. And maybe I'm again fronting a kind of like idea of metaphor or poetry or imagination as a way to try and evade a question about carbon content in these works. You know, the Columbus Project is still saved, stored in a friend's place.
But all the other ones are recycled.
So I do, decolonization is not a metaphor. Decarbonization is not a metaphor. I have hope that, the sort of neoliberal agendas that we live in North America, there is this sort of like tired winnowing. It sort of feels sort of like rigid, like they've been around long enough, like there's a sort of brittleness. And living in Minneapolis, we got to see moments where institutions and elected officials who have a kind of responsibility for public safety, things just failed. And in surprising ways, got to see a generosity of people. Like by and large, it was just like, thousands and thousands of people, and it was not chaotic, and so the difference between the kind of embodied experience of that time and place and people versus some of the media characterizations of that was at times very jarring. So that might be where there's a hopefulness and why we've been fronting a kind of like people, not property political agenda, which is, maybe not the most like thing, a political agenda that we're leading with. Just certainly there in the work. There's just a monologue, and I think that's it.
But I have to say, it was very refreshing for you not to kind of justify all the projects in terms of carbon emissions, because it's very honest. Because I've seen many talks recently where they really do try and have a whole spiel about carbon, which clearly wasn't on the table during the projects. But I thought that your political agenda came out most strongly in the images, no? And actually, I guess there's one more question before I pass it on to Charlotte or someone else about how I guess you seem to be in quite a privileged position in terms of having clients which aren't like commercial, whether that was a kind of conscious choice at the beginning of your practice that you don't want to do kind of service providing architecture where you build something and you try your best, but really you're part of the system. That you want to actually work with, public commissions or with ephemeral or with events-based or with kind of even things which are not traditionally at all considered part of an architect's brief, like photo series about riots, whether that was a kind of political decision at the beginning of your practice or whether you kind of moved from one sort of practice to another and kind of reframed it.
Yeah, someone wrote profile on us once where they were like, they graduated from school and then started making installations. And I was like, we're licensed architects. I worked for like almost a decade in architecture. When we started our practice, we kind of did what every practice does, and we did all different types of projects.
We had like a graphic, we had a logo, for example. I mean, it's sort of hilarious, right? Like it was really the grab bag.
But I think that they always had a kind of, we were working with like a woman who was starting a public school and trying to find a new space for this school. So doing kind of some visioning exercises with her and tested single properties. I mean, there was like, it kind of ran the gamut in terms of different things that we would do. But at the same time, we were also pretty committed to making installations in public space. And so, let's see, maybe 3 to 4 years into the practice, we like kind of took everything else off of the website and just said like, this is what we want to do more of. Because honestly, it was more fun, more interesting. It also happened on a faster timeline. In most of these projects, it was like too fast, like hide and seek, that was less than a year. And then a lot. It was like 6 months and at 18,000 square foot project. So I think right now it caused us to kind of design our lives and design the practice in a different kind of way. So we both teach, and
For 5 years, I run a metal fabrication company. It's pretty scrappy. Yeah. We were serious about wanting to do the installations.
So we had to find other ways to make money and have health insurance and all those other things. So I think, it's caused us to kind of do things in particular ways because that's the way that we want to work. So we also have done architecture projects, so we just don't show those as much.
For some reason they don't get built. Some of the larger things like
we've done a competition for a major museum that we didn't win. So so there are things that we've done that we just don't show.
Well, thanks for being open about this. I mean, we also have conversation. We also have conversation about how to build an emancipatory practice. You also need to have some sort of side gig or landed wealth sometimes, whatever. If you don't have like the kind of privilege to do that, then you will need to do something else. And then we talk about how important it is to actually disclose this fact, because otherwise we're just assuming that it's just easy to start and do something else, which is not the case in any case. So I'm just going to turn to our students who have kind of busied themselves also with some of the writings sent, and also would have probably questions in regard to what you presented.
May I make a disclosure along the lines you just suggested? So Jennifer, for 5 years, when we gave up the commercial practice, when we moved back to Minneapolis, Jennifer taught full-time at the University of Minnesota. A fabricator, Bo Jacobson, and I each put $2,000 into a business checking account and started a small metal fabrication company that I'm no longer a part of, but it was like, it took us 2 years until we had our first employee. It was probably like 4 years where each month it was like 20,000 in the account and the expenses go out and it comes back in, and there were no savings. So it's been a kind of process of like working so that we can work.
So thank you for allowing us to see the process behind your work. So we read the text, The Right to Look, and we talked about this idea of complicity. So just this profound mutualness that's needed between two people for the right to look and the right to be seen happen. And now looking at your work, I think there's also this mutualness between the individual and their environment. So in the first examples where somebody looks into a mirror and sees their reflection, and so it's kind of that mutual interaction between person and material. Or in the last example you gave where material kind of enables mutualness between people. So they start speaking of these quotes that you have on the polls. And so perhaps if you could speak more to how you see material kind of acting within your practice. Is it an enabler to these type of relations, or do you consider that relationship between individuals and the material, or is it more about just between people, or what can happen?
I guess I might come back and say that, at least for me, material is always social. To get anything done at this sort of scale, you need to know who works the brake press, or like who do you call in order to get something. Who do you call to get like a chunk of cold rolled steel for the weekend, so that because you've got a friend who's ready to turn it down. So for Monday, you can start applying these spiral decals on pipes or something. Prior to architecture, I came out of sculpture and large-scale sculpture, working for Ursula von Rydungsford and Ilya and Amelia Kabakov and others. And so there is something about the sort of relationship of body at scale and material that it has its own kind of intelligence. And so I think there's a kind of acknowledgement there, perhaps, that there are, I mean, just to probably state the obvious, like even Jennifer and I have like very different intelligences. Areas where one or other of us feel like we can step into a state of flow. You know, I feel like I might be monologuing because I'm talking a lot, but I appreciate you giving me the chance to, you know, that there's a number of different registers. And I think that the idea of material increasingly, like where, if you like, the sort of vulnerability, but then the feeling of like most, it's a sort of intuitive sense of where the returns are, has been thinking about like people's procedural memories and the kind of overwriting of memory in a particular place, and how people could interact somewhere, and how what you can do to change the capacity for of a particular context, because it unlocks something in people where they, you know, I have sort of high degrees of anxiety when these projects go up, because I don't know really like how it's going to work. For me, that's, if you like, a kind of leaning into discomfort. And so the discomfort of a material is actually really attractive. I don't know that that's necessarily the answer that you or I even was looking for. But I think there's a way that the physicality of a material, while attractive, like its surface quality or you know, these things are important. But I think there's also an evocative quality that is in the sort of psychic terrains, which is maybe more motivating.
Each time we each answer a question, I learned something about him. But the problem is it takes a long time because we each have to answer. No, I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, just put simply, like people have asked this before, like, yeah, why do you use steel? Why do you use mirrors? Why? I mean, we're using like also construction textiles, like these kind of like everyday sort of industrial materials. And I do think, you know, it's more about, for me, like what, that kind of language is one that is like part of a kind of infrastructure. It's also like, so yeah, I mean, so for me, the mirror is in a way a kind of like, you know, it's a provocative sort of surface in the sense that this kind of illusory depth, like there is this kind of feedback loop. There's this response that's happening in real time. Also is really, I mean, interesting, like when those walls are flexing around and the mirrors are moving, people would lose their balance. There's like another way in which, even though the space itself is not dynamic, like there's this kind of way in which that image comes into your body and you have a certain kind of physical response to it, which I thought was interesting. You know, all of our work isn't mirrored and shiny, but I guess we showed you that we're today. Yeah, I actually really liked your answer. So helping me with that.
We didn't talk about entangled landscapes, didn't talk about, you know, there's a lot else that to go, a lot of other registers to explore. I think thank you for your question.
Maybe two questions. The first one regarding like the public, like since you do like public installations, when you plan the project or you think about it, do you have in mind a bit like who is the public that's going to experience the installation? Does that change from a project to another? Or do you have a kind of like a targeted sort of public in mind, or is that not important? And then also, how do you since they are of like public and then sometimes ephemeral, do you have ways to kind of documenting or assessing like the reception of the works from the public? And do you kind of learn from that, or does that influence then how you do future works, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I think first off, there is a kind of way in which like the public is not like a singular entity, right? Like it's always, you know, really like kind of diverse people who are going to be in any one place. And I think that that's exciting to us, that, you know, there is a certain level of like uncertainty of who's going to be there, who's going to, you know, I mean, there's a 4-year-old boy that I met at PS1 who was like running around and chasing this mist and doing all these things, and had a really like great conversation with him. You know, it's not just like architects who are going to go there and think about, you know, whatever kind of influences they might bring disciplinarily. So I think I don't really think about like, I want particular people to go there and think and feel particular things when they are there. I'm a little bit more open to what will be. Belonging piece, we're like very bad about telling anybody that we've done anything. So that piece was just there and nobody really knew about it. And so we'd hear stories of people who would go there on their bicycles and kind of like find it as this sort of odd thing that was next to this transcontinental railroad track.
Like years later.
And then years later, we would find out, like, they were like, oh, you guys made that thing? Oh yeah, I went there. And then we like hung out with some friends and did mushrooms and like got lasers into the mirrors. And we were like, oh, okay. You know, so I think there are certainly specific ways in which we're thinking about the kinds of like gestures to interaction that the work might provoke. But it's not like, I think it's a bit more open-ended. With hide and seek, I would also say though that there was a very concerted effort to bring other kinds of audiences, other kinds of people into the museum context. Like in addition to doing that project, we had a whole other like agenda of events and programming and things that we wanted to do to like activate that space. And ultimately the museum was like, oh, we do better with objects than with people, and like we can't really like bring them, which was very disheartening, I think, for us, because we really saw it as like you know, a place where, yeah, it's not just about like reaching this kind of self-same audience that like already feels comfortable going to a museum like that. So, yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add about that.
Questions about like one public versus other publics, or our intention with respect to publics, and then are there kind of metrics or, and forgive me if I'm like misstating or mischaracterizing the question. You know, are there sort of metrics associated with that? And so in some ways the interest is in the institutional critique, and we've been lucky or fortunate to be shipping ideas that then get accepted by an institution that has a kind of autocritical interest. And so getting this admission from this curator at MoMA that the museum is really better at dealing with objects than with people, that was just like a mic drop, like, thank you. Like, you know, that was actually a generous admission. And in spite of it being a sort of dismaying outcome. Another project which we did not show, Lure, is in a gallery, Mad Art in Seattle. They have a mission statement that talks about community engagement. And there's a question there of like, what do you mean by community? And it's like, how would you feel if we just opened these massive plate glass doors that you have on your front facade in October through December, and you turn off the heat? Like, how do you feel about that? And you invite just anybody who's on the sidewalk in. And we had people, as we're making this, we're interacting with people on the sidewalk who are asking, like, what are you guys doing? You know, like, oh, we're creating airborne metal, you know. But they say, like, one fellow said, I've been walking down past this gallery for 7 years and never knew that it was for me. And I asked him, like, you know, what could be done here that would increase that level of accessibility, right? Because it's not just the invitation, it's they're like, yeah, I can step into that. And he just looked at me like I was like, well, like opening the doors and putting some ramps in is a good start, you know, like it's sort of self-evident. But that quality of invitation is something we're still learning. You know, it's not like there's a playbook or a rule book here in terms of how to interact with people, but you can sort of guess if something's at 18 inches, it could be a standpipe or a bench, people are going to sit on it. You know, there are metrics from different projects of attendance. You know, we don't foreground them because they're not like the most important. I mean, typically, like, yeah, people go and see a thing. And has it been like I don't know what the expression would be. But like PS1 was packed. This gallery like had record attendance in the fall. You know, it's not like a sort of a major thing, but like, yeah, it's surprisingly consistent when you introduce difference into people's built environment, like a kind of derive, something to pull people out of maybe the histories of movement they have in their day. People actually take you up on it. And that kind of engagement, joyful encounter with the unknown, you know, in spite of it, for me, being a kind of difficult thing emotionally to like let something just be alive in the world on its own, it actually seems to work. And we could give references for people we talk to and or our reading and dance and performance have begin to help structure our thinking. But in terms of being more specific about people in public, I think it's a fabulous question. But really, we're just trying to like sort of poke the bear in the eye and see if we can, you know, learn on a case-by-case basis what actually happens.
Are there questions?
Hey, thanks for the talk. I read the interview you had also proposed. I wanted to talk a little bit about that or ask you, I don't want to go into personal details either. I just understood that you kind of moved from Minnesota to Ithaca. Mm-hmm. And it felt very tied to the riots that happened. Although I wanted to talk more about the idea of visuality and the community trying to see itself, and let's call them the powers that be turning a blind eye, so to speak. And I wanted to also talk about this very first line where I think it was Jennifer that said, I disagree with the term because it would assume that there was a copacetic state at some point. And that I found super interesting and stuck with me. And I wanted to ask kind of this idea, or I read it almost as I cannot repair Minnesota in a way that I would like to raise my children in. So I will, but I just want to have some form of legibility towards the relationship between the community being able to see each other, the echoing of architecture that was completely that was erasing basically the traces of riots. And I wanted to basically talk about that and how that's how you relate to that, or how that impacts your decolonial work, or even the way that you treat visibility in your work.
Very good question. And it's a tough question. I mean, I think yeah, there's always this kind of moving in and out of frame, like moving in and out of vision, in and out of recognition, blind spot, this kind of disrupting the scene. So I think there's something of like how legible like we each need to be to each other, that is I'm okay with illegibility sometimes. But to more directly address your question, I mean, I think in that article, there is a certain discussion of like flight and like migration and talking about windows and portals and this kind of, again, I mean, we maybe can't like escape this kind of like poetic way of speaking. But you know, it's also like the premise for that issue of JE talking about reparations. It's like reparations is not a like metaphorical statement. Like that's actually like trying to introduce a kind of reparative framework. And what does that mean? Like, is that monetary? Is that what, you know, what form does that take? And yeah, I think that for us, just staying there became just kind of untenable. Doesn't mean that I won't ever go back. I grew up there. You know, I say that that's where I'm from. But I think there were just enough things that happened that it, just became a place that I needed to take a break from. There are really like incredible people who are there, who are, you know, that we're still in dialogue with, who are doing really incredible work in Minneapolis. It's not like it's all bad, but I think it was very close to home for us. So that induced a kind of flight. And it was very interesting, that article, to also like reflect on my own family and think about like my uncle being sent away from Montgomery, Alabama to go and live in Connecticut to finish high school, or my mother and my aunt being sent again from Montgomery, Alabama to the Allen School in North Carolina. That there's this continual like disassociation from home, disassociation from place, that I think also is evident in our work. This disorientation in a way. And I mean, we're talking about it within a kind of like social justice framework, which is maybe, you know, it's certainly entangled when we think about climate and environmental justice, right? Like I've worked for quite a while with an organization in North Minneapolis who's doing work around a number of, you know, industrial sites that are now being turned over to development. And so what happens to people in those communities? Like, do they actually benefit from the investment there? like they've been disinvested from. And then now there's a kind of like, you know, reintroduction of capital into that neighborhood. So who benefits? I think, you know, these kinds of conversations are happening at multiple registers, from the very close and very personal, and like within our own family to the larger communities that we're a part of. So yeah, I don't really know if I answered your question, like kind of about that, but I think being in Rome is another sort of flight in a way. And I think we've had to kind of like look at that about ourselves, like this kind of continual movement away. Yeah, so I think it's something that we're thinking a lot about.
I don't know that I have much to add to that.
I hope I answered this question. What's the question? To just expand on it a little bit further.
Feel free to nudge us with any revised or questions.
If I have to revise, it's almost like your relationship to place and what you're trying to say with your work has a bit of an importance on place and moment in time. And so this flight that you talk about becomes important because you're also yourselves changing in time. And so it's almost your relationship to place, and especially when it starts creating these weird frictions where your work is trying to go a certain way, and actually, as I call them, the powers that be kind of like remind you that actually we might be going the other way sometimes. And
I think, first of all, don't give the powers that be, as you call them, too much credit. You know, and just to be clear, the protests in Minneapolis, like the cops were rioting. Yeah, they were not controlled, at least from my perspective. And I would say one of the uneasy things from the last few years has been the ways that places can make themselves strange to you. It's like people can become strange. And it's not something that I come easily to, which is a kind of practice of love and forgiveness. And not that I'm in a sort of a place where, you know, there were just things that were too close at that time for me as a father to process. And I think, could we have stayed in Minneapolis? Yeah, without a question. And why was I open to moving is something I need to examine. You know, like in our pieces, not uncommon that they'll have sort of two planes facing each other. And so oddly enough, it's like, yeah, let's do the difficult work of moving that particular concern into sort of front of mind. Because, you know, was I just blind to a place that was the way it was, so that I just willfully not see it that way? Or did it actually was something latent that emerged in ways that felt problematic? Like Philando Castile, was murdered about a mile away from my metal shop. You know, we were fortunate in a ways to have a parenting moment for Mr. Floyd when he was murdered. I didn't have the heart to tell my son about Dante Wright. He found out about him at school, came home so upset. So there's you know, systemic things that it's not like you get a manual, you know, and it's not like you can hide behind cause and effect. And sometimes you just got to make a decision.
Thank you so much for answering. I understand it was a little question.
Yeah, thank you for your generosity on answering these difficult questions and sharing with us these topics, which are, essential and critical to address. I wonder if there is maybe one last question. We can otherwise close. I just want to thank you for, also showing us what's actually an emancipated form of spatial practice. I think there is also a lot of conversation of who can call themselves an architect. I think that it's also very important to tell us that you have had to do this commercial work and then you have decided to stop doing that and you have had to open a metal workshop to do that. And that, now you teach at Cornell and that also gives you a certain freedom. And, I think that it's really important that we have this conversation. We also have to hide behind this kind of meritocracy discourse about, who gets to do interesting things and who gets to do like unsolicited works. And I think there is really a kind of conversation about that, how we locate our being as architects. I also, I think that, Amy pointed at this difficult, a kind of point of contention, whether we can be architects at all, and the kind of needs to move beyond this kind of paralyzing, perhaps at times tetanizing kind of situation that we face. And I think we often use at the studio the term around crisis of imagination, the Mark Fisher formula as also something to say, well, architects have really the tools to move beyond that paralysis, and the work that you've shown, and I think very openly this conversation about also how there is also a conversation to be had about like how you see yourself as a body, as an architect, as an educator, as a parent, as a human, I guess.
Things are not disconnected.
Exactly, the impossibility. Even though we kind of battle this idea that architecture is not a calling, it's not a sacrificial undertaking, but there is a kind of difficulty to untangle these things. I personally do a lot of what I do because I'm generally angry, I think. So I found that there is this kind of room to articulate, having this hopefully useful formats within the schools, and being able to do this emancipatory work within the institution, even though the institution itself is, hostile. I think that this is like incredibly honest conversation that are really very important to also face actually the kind of multiple crises, right? In a way, the kind of urgencies that are surrounding us. Amy, would you like to add a few words? I think I would then otherwise give it back to you, and so we can do one, and then you guys will have the final word. But thank you.
Just very briefly, because I'm like slightly slow, honest. My partner, I wouldn't mention the baby. Had a baby. So I'm like slow at the moment. Like all the way through, what is the project? What is the project that you're working on? I know you realized when you started talking about like the institutions you're working within and the mirrors, and like, it's about like holding up the mirrors and back to the institutions to reflect back to themselves what, not just the institutions, but maybe the people also visiting these institutions, for them to kind of see the reflection of themselves, but then also a distortion of the reality that they're coming into contact with. And I thought that was, once you said that, I was like, clicked. Maybe just as a comment of the sort of content. But thank you very much for your talk. It was really great.
So is there, kind of wrap up? Maybe just a few words. I mean, we will have there are some snacks and drinks.
You're thirsty. Yeah, I think I just appreciated what you said at the end about like talking about the institution. I mean, we all, it's like we both teach at an Ivy League school in the US. there are certainly other ways to go, right? Like we're, yeah, trying to operate in the context knowing that like it fundamentally has like an inability to love me. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I just appreciated you actually acknowledging the difficulty of working inside of an institution. So that's like a whole other, could be a whole nother line of conversation. But yeah, I think, I don't know, I feel like to go back to the opening comment that you had, Amy, about like this kind of hopelessness or like, oh, it's just so depressing. I mean, it's like we can all just operate with the tools that we have. You know, like this is the arena that we've chosen to operate within, right? It's like within this context, these are the things that matter to us and the things that we want to put forward into the world as a certain kind of provocation. But everybody has to find like their own way and their own voice and their own, you know, arena that they feel is important and they're operating it in. And hopefully there is room for all of it. You know, so I think, yeah, we're not going to come here and say that we've done like some big, you know, like carbon modeling analysis like our projects, because we just haven't. But like there are certain things that we find that are core to our practice that we want to bring forward. And so I mean, I think that's the point of being in school and being exposed to lots of different types of ways of working, is finding out what is motivating to you, what you know you don't want to do, and what you hopefully see a little bit of what you do want to do. So, thank you for having us.
Yeah, I just hope that, you know, fundamentally, I think there's an issue of agency and whatever ways, whether it's like working collaboratively or like finding your cohort, pursuing whatever these things that, you know, maybe forms of knowledge that either the institution or other people don't value, but you somehow feel like there's worth there. But those, I mean, I don't mean to sound really hokey, but it's like, this stuff's fundamental. You know, like there's so many pressures that would say like, oh, that's not worth it, you shouldn't pursue that. But like, actually like that weirdness is like the thing to like, kind of like bite in on. We had a studio visit where we were reminded that essentially our practice is picking up like threads from other practices in the 1970s that were all abandoned because it is entirely unrealistic to be able to sort of meet certain basic needs. Doing this kind of work, you know, working in order to work has limits. And but the advice from this individual was just keep going. So at the risk of like getting really like naive and trite, you know, I feel like that agency needs to be underscored. And so I would maybe just close at least my corner of it by saying thank you all for inviting Jennifer and I here this evening. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's like making my world bigger. Appreciate it.
Thank you.